Um, okay, so the first speaker today is Dr. Sean Travers, who's from University College Cork in Ireland. Her PhD thesis examines innovative representations of trauma in late 20th and 21st century American popular culture. Her research interests include trauma fiction, horror, postmodernism, American fiction and cinema, game studies, naturalism and narratology. She is published in the Irish Journal of American Studies and has forthcoming publications in the Journal of Popular Culture and Fantastica. Her presentation today is entitled Nihilism, Violence and Popular Culture, the Postmodern Psychopath in Toby Fox's Undertale. So please take it away, Sean.
Okay, so today I'm going to discuss the representation of the postmodern psychopath in Toby Fox's metafictional game Undertale. According to Jean-François Lyotard, the postmodern condition is characterized by incredulity towards metanarratives, meaning skepticism towards the overarching grand narratives that purport to explain how the world works, such as, for example, history or religion. This decline of metanarratives has been found to produce traumatic effects, resulting in a profound sense of meaninglessness in the postmodern subject. According to Alan Pratt in his essay Nihilism, Lyotard's extreme skepticism towards the all-embracing foundations we rely on to make sense of the world undermines intellectual hierarchies and makes truth claims problematic. Though when we expose all cherished beliefs and sacrosanct truths as symptoms of a defective Western mythos, when we abandon these illusions, life is revealed as nothing, and this nothingness is the source of not only absolute freedom, but also existential horror and emotional anguish. This paper explores how this experience is represented in video games through a type of antagonist that I term the postmodern psychopath. These are characters that are represented in a similar manner to the psychopaths usually depicted in fiction, that is, antagonists characterized by violence and criminality. However, I argue that the postmodern psychopath is driven specifically by the feelings of meaninglessness and existential horror that are considered among the characteristics of the postmodern age by critics such as Pratt. To put it another way, this paper defines the postmodern psychopath as a type of antagonist that commits heinous acts simply out of the ennui that accompanies the apparent nihilistic postmodern conditions. Often literary and filmic depictions of the postmodern psychopath are subject to controversy due to their apparent glorification of violence and potentially dangerous influence upon viewers. Building upon this idea, this paper's main argument is that Undertale positions the player as a postmodern psychopath. I will explore how the game intentionally allows the player to take on the role of this type of villain through its exploitation of the increased level of interactivity unique to the game form. It's well established that players enjoy the ability afforded by games to explore their immorality and thus the glorification of violence. However, games' potential to translate their interrogation of players' moral framework to a real-world context has only begun to be explored. One way of overcoming this issue is through games' employment of metafiction. This approach has been considered by Toby Smethurst and Don Stobbart, both of whom examine how 2K games Spec Ops: The Line question players' culpability in the game's violence by punishing them for playing the game. My paper will examine how Undertale does this in a number of further innovative ways. Regarding psychopathy, there's a significant gap between the clinical definition of psychopathy and filmic psychopathy, or what we could call fictional psychopathy, as the character features in other media. Despite its common use in fiction, psychopathy is not a professionally recognized term for diagnosis and doesn't hold much meaning. The redundant and non-scientific term stems from antisocial personality disorder, APD. The DSM-5 criteria for APD includes pervasive patterns of disregard for the rights of others, deceitfulness, irresponsibility, lack of empathy, and aggressiveness. Contrary to popular belief, APD is one of the only personality disorders that's not characterized by psychosis, such as hallucinations, as demonstrated by Norman Bates in Psycho. And individuals with APD are not unaware of society's concepts of right and wrong, rather they hold no regard for it. Also, there's no intelligence differences in those with APD, whereas many fictional psychopaths are depicted as having superior intelligence, such as Thomas Harris's Hannibal Lecter. Furthermore, few individuals are violent and become murderers. However, it's here that the focus and fascination remains attached to such misconceptions in popular culture. Psychopaths in popular culture, then, are generally portrayed as the villains of the narrative, characterized by cruelty and violence. They may be portrayed as murderous misfits who possess some obvious impairment resulting in social rejection that cause their deep resentment towards society or specific groups, such as Norman Bates and Jason in Friday the 13th Part 2. Alternatively, they may exhibit exaggerated levels of intelligence, sophistication, and cunning, such as Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs. Most significantly, popular culture generally represents psychopaths as meticulous in devising and executing plans that are motivated by a long-term goal. This ignores two important symptoms of APD, lack of goals and focus, and impulsivity. By contrast, I argue that the postmodern psychopath incorporates these symptoms, which reflects the nihilistic perspectives associated with postmodernity, the feelings of meaninglessness that stem from the realization that traditional concepts of order and authority are artificial constructs. The postmodern psychopath is calculating and devises their violent acts, but they are motivated by ennui and curiosity rather than a specific long-term goal. While carefully planned, their decisions and violence appear aimless, experimental, and without destination. For instance, the postmodern psychopath is evident in American Psycho. Patrick Bateman is an affluent businessman and a serial killer who murders people for no concrete reason other than boredom. For instance, he doesn't have a traumatic childhood. Patrick possesses a nihilistic outlook and believes that everything, including choice and morality, is meaningless. His violence in turn appears arbitrary despite being meticulously devised. Patrick kills a variety of people with no preferred victim type or method of killing. For example, Patrick kills a child essentially to see if he would enjoy it. Similarly, Brian Fueller's Hannibal, the protagonist commits heinous acts simply to see what happens, such as hiding his patient's encephalitis as he's curious about the outcome. While such acts are meticulously planned, they appear random and pointless because curiosity is the motive. This is in contrast to Silence of the Lambs Hannibal, who is at least in part motivated by his goal to escape confinement. Likewise, there's neither reason nor purpose for the chaos committed by Heath Ledger's Joker in The Dark Knight. When Bruce Wayne asserts that criminals are not complicated, that they just need to uncover what this one wants, Alfred responds that the Joker doesn't want anything, that some men just want to watch the world burn. Christopher Nolan's depiction of the Joker adverts to no childhood trauma or scientific experiment gone awry, with the Joker providing contradicting explanations regarding his facial scarring. The Joker also sets fire to huge piles of money, believes that life is pointless, and declares that he has no plans, that he just does things. Texts featuring postmodern psychopaths are often subject to controversy, generating concerns regarding their apparent glorification of violence and the potentially negative influence upon impressionable viewers. American Psycho was expected to contribute to the violence that afflicts American society. Similar fears were expressed regarding The Dark Knight's depiction of knife threat and copycat attacks. Certain texts make metafictional reference to this idea of the viewer's role in the endorsement of violent media entertainment. In Fueller's Hannibal, Hannibal asks his former therapist if she's observing or participating in his murders. Metatextual slasher films, including Scream and Wes Craven's New Nightmare, take a similar, more overt approach, featuring self-aware characters that are, like the viewer, fans of slasher films and enthusiastic about the genre's violent conventions. Funny Games likewise aims to interrogate the viewer's complicity in violent media, centering on two home invaders who take a family hostage for no apparent reason other than entertainment. Like Nolan's Joker, they offer a number of bogus tragic backstories to explain their motivations. Addressing the audience via asides, the invaders deliver upon thriller fans' desire to see on-screen violence. I argue that Undertale similarly positions players as postmodern psychopaths through the employment of metafictional techniques then, and by exploiting games' capacity for interactivity, exploring player immorality in relation to the medium's apparent glorification of violence. Because of the level of interactivity unique to the game form, the medium can more effectively encourage its audiences to identify and empathize with protagonists, and more directly experience the violent acts perpetrated by the controllable protagonist. This increased level of interactivity and how players have varying degrees of narrative agency over events and characters in games has been used as a means of positioning the player as the villain of the narrative. Interactivity is the most commonly referenced characteristic that marks games out as different from other media and makes them particularly suited to do this. Examining perpetrator trauma in games, Mother states that by innovating with the interactivity and player agency that define them as a medium, games can involve the player in the complicity, guilt, and potential trauma of the perpetrator through methods uniquely available to games. In particular, games which interconnect ludic play and narrative engagement, or moral choice games, which employ decision-making as one of their main mechanics, allow players to virtually perpetrate the violent acts which occur in the narrative. This can be regarded as an attempt by the game to position the player as the antagonist of the narrative and transmit to players feelings including complicity, moral contradiction, and guilt, which is commonly referred to as gamer guilt. The term transmission stems from trauma theory and refers to the attempt to simulate in audiences the experience of a character in a text. To achieve this in trauma literature, for instance, traumatic events are often represented according to the most indirect and experimental aesthetic forms possible. For example, fragmented nonlinear chronologies might be employed to represent a character's flashbacks of a traumatic incident in an attempt to make the reader feel similarly disorientated. Also, narrative agency arguably increases players' narrative and emotional investment, bringing about immersion in games, which makes the player feel as though they're part of the game narrative and experience the actions taking place on the screen almost as if they're happening to the player. The game feels real to the player because the world exists in that moment of playing, and moral choices carry a similar weight to real-world choices for the player, despite affecting a secondary world. The distinction between the game world and the real world is important to interrogate in terms of the psychological effect of in-game moral decisions. The terms secondary world and virtual violence are significant, underlining the idea that gaming is sufficiently bracketed off from reality and that this is not real immorality that the player commits and experiences, but a simulated form of it. While certain critics acknowledge metagaming, such as fan practices, the virtual environments at play in these scenarios certainly don't threaten our grasp on reality. The virtual is still frequently figured as false, illusory, or imaginary. Smother summarizes this idea when discussing the transmission of perpetrator trauma in games, noting that games are not capable of traumatizing the player directly, but present a virtual representation of the symptoms of trauma experienced by the player through play, similar to how one experiences a book by reading it. The questioning of players' moral framework then does not actually translate to anything concrete outside the environment of the game. One way of overcoming this issue, however, is the employment of metafiction. The employment of metafictional techniques and thematics in games is a trend that's becoming popular, particularly in moral choice games, which seek new ways to increase player immersion and narrative agency. Metafiction in more traditional narrative forms, such as literature and film, tends to work to distance audiences from the world of the text and foregrounding its artifice, often for the purposes of parody or critique. By contrast, games employ metafiction to both critique the medium and create greater audience immersion. Metafiction in gaming forces the player to reflect on their role as both the audience for and participant within the narrative. For instance, when a game makes a metafictional reference to the text as a game and chastises the player's violent in-game actions as opposed to those of the controllable protagonist, the player is urged to consider the ways in which they engage with virtual violence, and by extension, violent content more generally, for the purposes of entertainment. What's potentially explored successfully in games that employ metafiction, then, what one would call the moral point of these texts, is players' capacity for immorality in relation to the game medium specifically. How even though it's only a game, players enjoy and sensationalize violent content. Such games communicate directly with the player to reprimand players for not only their in-game violence, but for how they engage with the game medium. The game's interrogation of the player's moral framework, therefore more successfully translating to a real-world context. Metafictional games are thus a very appropriate medium for representing the postmodern psychopath, a type of villain who commits violence primarily for entertainment. Metafictional games reprimand players for in-game violence linked to two expected play patterns of gamers: the player's complicity in the endorsement of violent media entertainment by engaging with such texts, and expected play patterns of replayability. Replayability is how users may play a game twice or multiple times so as to see the results of choices that differ to those made in their first playthrough, to access narrative content they had missed. While players usually play heroically in moral choice games, a common tendency among gamers is to play villainously when replaying the game. Angela Land reports that players are willing to experiment with alternatives only on their second playthroughs, that they usually play through first following the good storyline, and that evil is held for a second, lower priority playthrough after they've played the game correctly. There are two reasons for this. Firstly, during an initial playthrough, the player is apt to be more invested and more connected to the choices they make, whereas with repeat playthroughs, the player is selecting choices from a place of increased knowledge. And that knowledge the player possesses and brings to the narrative in repeat playthroughs lacks the necessity of critical reflection the first play experience attempts to provide. The second reason is curiosity and entertainment. In players' more detached replays of games, in-game decisions are not the result of their moral convictions, but as with representations of the postmodern psychopath found in more traditional media, experimenting with narrative alternatives. These tendencies for player replayability then are an issue for developers who wish to have the player think over their choices in a meaningful way. Recent games such as Undertale attempt to overcome this notion of arbitrary detached decisions driven by narrative curiosity through their various metafictional techniques. These include the collapse of the distinction between player and avatar, references to the genre of moral choice games, and chastising the player for both engaging with these games and attempting to replay the game so as to undo certain actions and try out different in-game choices. The player in these games is thus made to feel like a postmodern psychopath, virtually perpetrating violence for entertainment, and paradoxically experiencing feelings including complicity, moral contradiction, and guilt specifically for how they interact with the medium in this way. I say paradoxically here because the postmodern psychopath is usually represented in line with the characterization of individuals with APD, as having no regard for concepts of right and wrong. In this way, Undertale's depiction of postmodern psychopathy aligns with that of funny games. Undertale positions the player as a type of villain who commits heinous acts for entertainment without regard for morality, but the game at the same time foregrounds the idea that we often take this role when engaging with violent media entertainment and attempts to make us feel guilty for our similar guilt-free enjoyment of fictional violence. An exemplar of this type of game is Toby Fox's Undertale. Undertale is a metafictional game that relies on player input to determine the outcomes of the narrative and characters, some of which are self-aware of their status as fictional NPCs, non-player characters, and acknowledge the player as a separate entity from the protagonist. Undertale is an RPG-inspired game, role-playing game, in which the player controls the human child who's fallen into the underground, an underground world populated by monsters. The player has the option to either murder the monsters they encounter, which is called the Genocide Route, or spare them via non-violent contextual means, such as befriending and helping them with their problems, which is called the Pacifist Route. The narrative differs markedly depending upon the player's actions. The Pacifist Route is a light-hearted adventure story with a happy ending whereby the protagonist can either break out of the underground or remain there and become adopted by Toriel, a goat woman who acts as a guide throughout the game. The Pacifist Route concludes with either the protagonist enjoying a sunset outside or being tucked into bed by Toriel. If the Genocide Route is chosen, Undertale becomes a horror game and the player is the antagonist, or as I argue, a postmodern psychopath. The protagonist gains enormous power and the underground's various towns are empty as NPCs fear the protagonist. The visual tone of the game changes from brightly colored to grayscale, the humorous dialogue becomes pessimistic and the upbeat soundtrack becomes distorted. When the player empties the underground of all of its monster inhabitants, Undertale ends with the protagonist destroying the game itself. There's also a range of neutral routes based on specific choices, such as which and how many characters the player kills or spares, and how the player interacts with them during their playthrough. Undertale positions the player as an antagonist in relation to their engagement with the game medium, focusing specifically on players' contribution to the sensationalism of violent media entertainment and replayability tendencies. As Undertale is an RPG, the game critiques the violent ludic structures of mainstream games, whereby the player is not only required to commit virtual violence, but in order to progress, as in defeating enemies encountered, but rewarded for doing so in the form of granting the controllable protagonist increasing power and abilities, usually called experience points. Undertale simulates in the player feelings of complicity and guilt for this approach to gaming in a number of ways. In the Genocide Route, the player is punished rather than rewarded for their cumulative violence in the form of increasingly disturbing content, dialogue, and imagery, undermining the usual power fantasies in RPGs. How Undertale punishes the player in this way is a concept inherited from Spec Ops: The Line. Games typically require the player to learn skills and offer a reward system for the successful implementation of those skills. In Spec Ops: The Line, as the player controls the protagonist's journey deeper into the underground, in Spec Ops: The Line, as the player controls the protagonist's journey deeper into the game's environment, they begin to realize that the reward for the successful implementation of ludic skills is instead a punishment. The game's tone becomes darker and the player is subjected to scenes of escalating brutality. While the game does not allow a diegetic choice, at each point in the game where actions are immoral, the player is offered a choice, which is to stop playing. So player's continuation of the game is a conscious choice. That Undertale contains a number of neutral routes and endings further implicates the player in the horrific events taking place in the narrative, simulating in the player feelings of responsibility for the violence that unfolds on screen and evoking the type of causeless violence inflicted by postmodern psychopaths, as the player has the option at any time to cease killing the monsters they encounter and begin sparing them rather than to stop playing the game. Indeed, sparing any character during the Genocide Route changes it to a neutral route, and the game concludes with one of the neutral endings. Killing monsters in Undertale is also in contrast to conventional in-game killings, whereby the player progresses through repeated fight sequences with numerous faceless enemies, or to kill without guilt or a second thought. Characters in Undertale's Genocide Route plead with the player to spare them, while characters such as Papyrus, a skeleton monster that the player befriends during the pacifist or neutral routes, asserts that the player can do better as they murder him. Further, in enabling players to kill characters in the Genocide Route that they had befriended and emotionally invested in during previous pacifist or neutral playthroughs, Undertale simulates guilt in the player specifically by acknowledging replayability tendencies, how players tend to play the good path in their initial playthrough and the evil path on their second in order to access additional narrative content. Undertale enables players to grow close to characters like Papyrus in the pacifist or neutral routes. We gradually learn that Papyrus is lonely and has a mental disability that reduces his mind to a childlike state. Players can also phone this character throughout the game, getting additional lines of his humorous dialogue and words of encouragement. Certain self-aware characters make direct reference to players' replayability tendencies and endorsement of violent media content. These characters acknowledge the player as a separate entity from the protagonist that has the power to save and reload at will, and remark that the player is playing the Genocide Route because they're accustomed to the violent ludic structures of mainstream games, and as with the postmodern psychopath, to satisfy their narrative curiosity. In the Genocide Route, Papyrus's brother Seán says to the player, "You're not doing this because you're evil, you're doing this because you can, and because you can, you feel you have to," evoking the arbitrary nature of decision-making found in both the ludic structures of games and depictions of aimless postmodern psychopaths. Moreover, the game keeps track of players' save files, with characters remembering and making reference to player actions performed before they loaded their saved game. Players who restart a game without saving to undo an in-game murder will find that characters are aware of this and will berate the player for abusing their power of the save state and performing virtual violence as a means of experimentation. An instance of such is when players accidentally kill Toriel during the tutorials, wherein she explains the game's combat mechanics. While the player starts the game over to undo this act, the dialogue changes to reflect that they've already killed Toriel in their previous playthrough, such as Toriel recalling the player's previous dialogue choices. Flowey, a talking flower that can fully retain his memory between saves, and one of the game's antagonists, also appears and whispers, "You murdered her, and then you went back because you regretted it," acknowledging the prior in-game killing as the players rather than the controllable protagonists. Undertale also acknowledges when players start the entire game over to try a different route, with each playthrough affected by how they played previously. The order of playthroughs has varying consequences. When playing the Genocide Route after the pacifist or neutral routes, Flowey condemns the player for undoing the happy ending the player previously achieved for the Underground's inhabitants. Here, Flowey reveals himself to have once been a player-like entity that has played through the game multiple times. Flowey became self-aware of his environment as a video game, gaining the ability to save and load the game, and likens himself to the player. He characterizes himself as a postmodern psychopath, explaining that he too turned evil out of NUI. Flowey bemoans his boredom and claims to have exhausted every possible in-game action and decision branch. He chastises the player for doing the same and denounces the wider game medium, making reference to in-game violence in direct relation to players' tendency for replayability. Flowey points out that the player's emotional impact is lessened upon repeat playthroughs and that replayability is driven by a sadistic narrative curiosity, that the need to complete a game 100% tempts players to go back and play a game's evil route. For instance, Flowey says, "I soon realized I didn't feel anything about anyone. Interested, I decided to experiment. At first, I used my powers for good. I became friends with everyone. I solved all their problems. As time repeated, people proved themselves predictable. What would this person say if I gave them this? What would happen if I killed them? It all started because I was curious, you understand." Flowey ponders if curiosity is an excuse for the power fantasy that games grant players, allowing one to exert total control over a virtual world and its inhabitants as a means of entertainment. He says, "What an excuse, you of all people must know how liberating it is to act in this way." Further, if the player goes through the Genocide Route again or multiple times, Flowey fittingly punishes the replay-minded player. He vows to remain silent from now onwards, refusing to give any more dialogue or new content and giving the player no incentive to play the Genocide Route again. Going beyond games such as Spec Ops: The Line, then, Undertale thwarts the player's narrative curiosity, acknowledging how player tendencies for replayability are additionally motivated by this, and how, similar to the postmodern psychopath, players commit immoral in-game actions as a means of experimenting with narrative alternatives. The game also takes into account players who solely play the pacifist or neutral routes and watch the Genocide Route online here. These players specifically are positioned as postmodern psychopaths. If an individual is live streaming their playthrough on YouTube, Flowey claims that online viewers watching another gamer perform in-game violence are equally culpable in the violence taking place on screen, but are too cowardly to participate in these events. He says, at least we're better than those sickos that stand around and watch it happen. Those pathetic people that want to see it but are too weak to do it themselves. I bet someone like that's watching right now, aren't they? Playing the genocide route before the pacifist also has unique effects on the narrative and employs innovative tactics to make the player feel like a postmodern psychopath. Upon relaunching the game post-genocide route, the player is given the option to reset the game world and play through it again. Here, the player is addressed by another self-aware character that looks almost identical to the game's protagonist. They question the player about the violence inherent to engaging with games, such as why one finds it entertaining to destroy a game world and recreate it, and if the player thinks they're above consequences when interacting with a virtual world. This character is revealed to be the game's main antagonist and introduces themselves with the name the player purportedly gave to the controllable protagonist at the beginning of the game. Players conventionally use their own name when naming a controllable protagonist, and if the player does so in Undertale, the name of the game's villain is literally that of the player. This character informs the player that they were brought to life by the controllable protagonist's killing, increasing power, that is, the experience points gained whenever a monster is killed, and therefore the player's sadistic curiosity. Indeed, Stobbart likewise notes that when games reveal the controllable protagonist as the narrative's antagonist, this makes the player feel further complicit in the game's violence. Furthermore, if the player chooses to reset the game and try out the pacifist or neutral routes, these routes are altered to incorporate references to the player's immoral acts in their previous genocide playthrough. Playing the pacifist route after the genocide concludes with either the protagonist in bed facing the camera with glowing red eyes, accompanied by a low-pitched laugh and frightening music, or a photograph of monsters with their faces crossed out, reminding the player that they had murdered these characters in their previous playthrough. Undertale's unique employment of interactivity and involvement of the player in a position of endorsement with violence has significant implications. What marks Undertale out as innovative in terms of these types of games is the player's greater degree of choice. The player can avoid violent content altogether in Undertale via the pacifist and neutral routes, whereas conventionally players must follow the path laid through by the game's designers in order to experience the entire game and thereby actuate its potential as fully as possible. In Spec Ops: The Line, players can justify their actions because they have no choice but to use violence in order to progress through the game. While players have the option to stop playing Spec Ops: The Line, their continued interaction with the game is not as voluntary as its lead writer Walt Williams suggests. Continued gameplay in Spec Ops: The Line is attributable not to the player's bloodthirst, but to the considerable psychological pressures involved when one is playing a game. One must also factor in the player's drive to go along with the rules of the game in place. The authority is the player's contract with the game, that is, their illusory attitude. This has been considered by critics such as Smothers as a flaw in the game with regards to player choice. This flaw is evident in other metafictional titles. Choices in Until Dawn frequently consist of forcing rather than inviting players to decide between enacting different violent actions in order to advance the narrative. Zero Escape, Zero Time Dilemma contains interconnected good, evil, and neutral pathways. The player is required to play through all of these paths to access the narrative in totality and make sense of the game's story. Conversely, Undertale's pacifist and neutral routes provide the player with a fully realized narrative, a definitive ending, and an average gameplay length for an independent game at least of approximately 10 hours. The Genocide Route is a wholly optional, separate story that takes place in an alternate timeline from the pacifist or neutral routes. The Genocide Route can almost be considered a different game from the pacifist or neutral playthroughs, being a horror game rather than an adventure game. Additionally, while the Genocide Route provides further narrative content, its narrative is largely about undoing the events of the pacifist and neutral routes rather than adding to these narratives. Therefore, Undertale more clearly situates players as aimless, nihilistic, postmodern psychopath because players follow the genocide mode to completion without the kinds of external motivations found in other games. This exemplifies that games, because of their requirement of players' active input, can implicate audiences in on-screen violence in ways that more traditional media, including films such as funny games, cannot. Undertale's representation of the postmodern psychopath is also significant in terms of trauma representation. Firstly, perpetrator trauma is often depicted in a similar way to victim trauma, despite there being differences in real-world examples. For the perpetrator, one of the most significant differences includes the experience of a profound moral contradiction rather than intrusive memories. For Raya Morag, the core of perpetrator trauma lies in the profound moral contradictions challenging the perpetrators rather than their psychological disintegration or intrusive memories. As events perpetrators tend to face are not sudden, overwhelming events, but events in which they participated in and made a conscious decision to act, and sometimes were aware of in advance. While perpetrators may suffer from recurring belated symptoms similar to those of trauma victims, they relate to the perplexity of denial of wrongdoing or the inability to prevent returning to the guilt-ridden experience rather than to the incomprehensibility of the traumatic event. Therefore, perpetrator trauma, as Morag says, induces perpetrators to reflect on the fissures of their own integrity. As we've seen, Undertale continuously prompts players to do this. A further example of such occurs upon relaunching the game post-Genocide Route. Here, the player is presented with a black screen accompanied by howling wind sound effects. The game's window is unnamed, inputs have no effect, and the player must wait 10 minutes before engaging with the game again. The use of a blank screen here, a reflective surface, can be interpreted as a mirror whereby the player must look at themselves and reflect upon their actions, having played cruelly through the genocide route. Secondly, Alan Gibbs identifies guilt as a symptom associated with perpetrator trauma in particular. However, Gibbs argues that perpetrator trauma may be particularly marked by a gradual rather than an instant or sudden process. When discussing war literature, he claims that an insidious secretion of guilt coupled with the disillusionment about the cause being fought for evidently prompts perpetrator trauma in certain protagonists, and the perpetrator trauma in this sense is often the result of guilt or shame over a series of acts of increasing intensity or depravity. As we've seen, this is also reflected in Undertale, whereby the player is subjected to increasingly horrific content the further they engage with the genocide route. To conclude, reflecting contemporary nihilistic conditions, the postmodern psychopath is a character that commits heinous acts for curiosity's sake, one who turns evil simply to see what happens. This character is evident in a range of media, but because of the interactivity of the game medium, texts such as Undertale have the capacity to position the audience as postmodern psychopaths. Further, because of its innovative metafictional techniques, Undertale more directly challenges players for their endorsement of violent media content and uniquely translates the interrogation of players' morality to a real-world context, as well as contributes to perpetrator trauma representation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean. That was a fantastic talk, and it's generated quite a lot of chat, and Chloe assures me she's going to mine that chat for questions, and we will reserve questions for the end. We'll have the second speaker now, Charlotte Gislam, who is a PhD researcher here at MMU. Her supervisory team is Paul Wake and Chloe Germain, who obviously are present. Her PhD is funded by an Arts and Humanities Research Council scholarship and is entitled Artificial Intelligence and Dynamic Spatial Storytelling in Digital Games. She has published reviews in Fantastica and for the Manchester Games Studies Network website. Her presentation today is entitled Learning Spatial Grammar in the Binding of Isaac. Charlotte, please take it away.
Hello, can everybody hear me okay? I'm assuming yes. So. Right, I have a confession. My talk is not the standard one. I'm going to be presenting a video today because I am showing some gameplay that I've done with me talking over the top. So first of all, what I need to make sure I do is bring up the chat and put in a link. So that is a link to the talk if this shared screen just does not work and there's an issue. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to start sharing the screen with the video, and I'm going to do 30 seconds and I'm going to ask if everybody can hear and it's going okay. So share sound, optimize the video. Let's get that shared. So let's do I'll do about 15 seconds and see how it goes for a start. Hello, and thank you very much for coming to this talk today. This talk has been pre-recorded because I am talking over a version of me playing through The Binding of Isaac with some editing placed over the top. Can I ask, is this working for people? Yes, good, lovely. I realised then I needed to bring up the chat. Excellent. Right, I will mute myself, mute future me and my camera, and I'll leave you with past me, and I'll see you in 25 minutes. I couldn't do this live, mainly because I think my laptop would just explode, so I apologise for that, but the future version of me will be available afterwards for questions. Also, fair warning, I haven't really done this with a talk before, so as well as feedback on the content, I would really be interested to see how you find this structure. My hope is that by showing you this game as I talk, you can get an idea of how space is constructed and then navigated better than a PowerPoint slide could do, anyway, at least. So before I begin, a quick rundown of what I am hoping this talk will achieve today. First of all, I'm going to explain what The Binding of Isaac is, as a commercial object, as a narrative, and as a playable experience. I am going to provide a quick primer on procedural content generation, what it is, and what it's got to do with this game. From there, I will start with the real meat and potatoes of the talk. How does the procedural generation of space change how players interact with the game space? How it asks the player to engage in a continual process of uncovering, which I will theorise with the help of the theoretical component Marco de Soto and his work on pedestrian speech acts. Finally, I want to end by discussing what this has to do with the Gothic. How does the player's uncovering mirror the Gothic protagonist's uncovering, and what happens when that becomes theoretically infinite? With that done, it's final calls and bets on how quickly I'll die. Obviously I know, but I will not tell you. So let's begin. The Binding of Isaac is a roguelike game made by a two-man team, Edmund Macmillan and Florian Himsel. It was originally released in 2011 on the Steam under the title of The Binding of Isaac. It then got an expansion in 2012 called Wrath of the Lamb. It was then ported in an updated version of the game called The Binding of Isaac Rebirth in 2014 to consoles. A further update of the game was released in 2017 called The Binding of Isaac Afterbirth Plus, which is the version which this talk references. But what I am playing is the newest version of the game, The Binding of Isaac Repentance, the final update, I hope, which released this year, March 2021, just in time to mess with the nicely organised chapter I had written on the game. There isn't too much of a difference between the most recent Repentance version though and the earlier Afterbirth Plus version. They both use the same method to produce space, and it is still steeped in biblical references, so for the purposes of the talk they're interchangeable. But I'm happy to speak to some of the actual differences in questions if we have any hardcore Isaac fans in the audience. Story-wise, the game is a very loose adaptation of the biblical story of the same name. God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac at the top of a mountain to prove his faith to God. Abraham and his son go to the mountaintop, and just before Abraham does the deed, God presents a lamb to be sacrificed in Isaac's place. In the game, it differs as it takes place in modern times. It's Isaac's mother who hears God telling her to kill Isaac, the father is out of the picture, and Isaac understands what his mother is about to do and runs. In the opening cutscene, Isaac, in a moment of panic, sees a trapdoor which is miraculously opened. He does not hesitate and drops down into the game you're seeing now. Beautifully timed. Dropping into the trapdoor. In addition to the narrative taking from the biblical story, The Binding of Isaac uses a lot of biblical imagery, alongside horror of the body, and at points specifically horror of the female body, to build the story within a biblical Gothic mode. Texts included in a kind of biblical Gothic include Paradise Lost, The Monk, Melmoth the Wanderer, and the Loney. The roots of this style of Gothic come, Diane Long Hovella suggests, from the growing confusion that existed between the realms of reason and faith, and that this uneasy coexistence of the immanent and the transcendent can be seen throughout the Gothic corpus. The Binding of Isaac taps into this reservoir of biblical imagery, presenting to the player bosses who are simply either directly named after their biblical counterparts, such as Satan, or who are indirectly named, such as the Duke of the Flies, a reference to the Lord of the Flies, Beelzebub. Items which reference the biblical include holy texts, the Bible, the Book of Revelations, demonic entities, Abaddon and Lord of the Pit, angelic entities / items such as Guardian Angel and Holy Mantle, religious relics, corporeal or not, such as Judas's shadow and Lazarus's rags, and references to the crucifixion, stigmata and blood of martyr being that. Combined with the locations Sheol and Cathedral, The Binding of Isaac's mise-en-scène establishes the Gothic through a lens of the biblical. Gameplay-wise, you'll notice that the main verbs that are available to me on the controller are move and shoot, and occasionally bomb. I am controlling how Isaac moves with the left stick, and the right stick is used to shoot tears at the enemies, up, down, left and right. And yes, it is tears he's shooting. He's a very sad little guy. What I need to do is to get Isaac from the starting room I opened in to the boss room, where a trapdoor will appear to take me down to the next level. The controller verbs of move and shoot are part of a more overall verb, to uncover, a verb which is shared by protagonists in other non-game Gothic texts such as The Mysteries of Udolpho, Jane Eyre and Crimson Peak. I must uncover the space through these actions which the controller allows me to perform, in a similar way as Edith of Crimson Peak must uncover the spaces and secrets of the manor before it is too late. In the game, this process continues with each floor becoming larger and more difficult to defeat the deeper I go into the game, until I reach the final boss. No, I'm not saying whether or not I get to the final boss, but I wouldn't be so confident. However, to continue down into the next level, I need to find the boss room first. When describing this game, I called it a roguelike, but didn't define what that was. That's because I was saving it as a tasty treat for now. Roguelike is a descriptor which means that the game contains a cluster of mechanics which were reused in the original Rogue of 1980. The Berlin interpretation of roguelikes filters the mechanics into high value factors and low value factors. For games to be considered a roguelike, they must have some combination of these factors. There are many variations of roguelikes, but for today and this talk, what needs to be known is that a game, according to the Berlin interpretation, should include random environment generation and permadeath to be considered a roguelike. And by that measure, The Binding of Isaac is a roguelike. Although, and I will return to this, the randomness of the Berlin interpretation alludes to isn't as random as it appears. It can feel quite random to the player, but there are a lot of strict rules which govern how the environment is generated. What having random environment generation and permadeath means for the player is that each time a fresh playthrough of The Binding of Isaac begins, the layout changes. The environment is generated fresh each time. If I open, well, I can't open the map, I'm talking over it, but you can see on the little map in the top right hand corner that the room I'm in at the moment is it's got a little sword in it and it's white, and the other rooms that have been discovered are kind of like a light grey, but the room that's on the right at the top in like a cross formation is slightly greyed out, and that means that I haven't actually walked into that room, but by being in the room beforehand I can kind of see the shape, but the rest of it is blank. As such, getting to the boss room becomes more of an obstacle. The answer to which way should I go to reach the boss changes each playthrough. On the early floors, which we're on now, that's not so much of an issue. There are no more than a handful of rooms, so getting to the boss isn't so bad. But later rooms spiral out, and you can spend ages in the southern part of the map when the boss room is actually all the way in the north. And throughout this playthrough, you'll see this happen to me several times. This has a massive effect on play, as maybe I am showing. I'm not that bad, but the game is quite hard. The more time you spend fighting enemies which aren't on the quickest path to the boss, the more likely you are to lose health and die. And when you die, it's permadeath. A new layout is generated and you begin again, with no health upgrades or items you've picked up. So a lot of the difficulty of the game comes from denying the player spatial knowledge. Without it, the player must do their best to carve out a route each time they play. So, how does The Binding of Isaac randomly generate its environment? Well, it does it through procedural content generation, which is defined by Noor Shaker, Julian Tegalius and Mark J. Nelson as the algorithmic creation of game content with limited or indirect user input. In other words, PCG is a set of programs which produces content without the user having to directly guide that process. The Binding of Isaac achieves this through seed values, a jumble of numbers and letters which is read by the algorithm and used to spit out a new layout for the player to uncover. The seed value for this particular playthrough that I'm going through is LVTZ7674. If you have a copy of the game and would like to play along or explore this seed later, you can input this string of numbers and letters to get the same layout. But this is just one seed. The Binding of Isaac seed values can hold a combination of 8 characters, which can either be letters of the alphabet or numbers 0 to 9, excluding 5, I, O and U, which results in the possibility space of 32 to the power of 8, or, roughly, 1,99,511,627,776 possible levels, which is a lot of possible combinations. The use of a seed does limit the numbers of levels generated. There can't be infinite combinations. However, the number of possible combinations is far beyond what a single human can experience. I should say as well that the seed value doesn't just provide the algorithm with a free ticket to just throw a level together randomly. Instead, the space is determined by a set of rules which build into a kind of system of grammar for building space. To show you an example of this, I'm going to, through the power of editing, show you some pseudocode. Whoopah! Pseudocode is not the actual code you'd pull from the game files, but it is a readable version of the rules of the game, which don't refer to any specific coding language. And by readable, I mean it's still ridiculously complicated. So what is on screen now is the pseudocode for determining the number of rooms in a level. The code ensures that early levels have a smaller number of maximum rooms it can produce, this number increasing the further the player progresses, where the player may have up to 20 rooms to navigate. This is due to variables in their calculation. So the first line of this pseudocode, which includes that really off-putting calculation, takes the smallest number from either 20 or the result of a random number between 0 and 1 plus 5 plus the resulting combination of the next little addition. So that is stage ID, which comes with a very specific number, times by 10 divided by 3. Stage ID increases the further the player is along the in the game, and as such provides a larger number to be added into the equation. As a result, the amount of rooms should increase every stage the player progresses through. The code includes an extra element which can change the experience of the level growth for players. In the pseudocode above, there is a reference to Curse of the Labyrinth and Curse of the Lost, which both affect the number of rooms available to the player. Curse of the Lost, for example, will add 4 to the total number of rooms. These effects will only happen on the stage the curse occurs on, and it is not guaranteed to happen in every iteration of the game. Oh, I'm sorry, talking is thirsty work. So, it is not random, there are rules. There are also rules about placement of the rooms. So special rooms, such as bosses, shops, item rooms, etc., are placed in order from the dead end furthest from the starting room to the closest. If all the dead ends on the floor become occupied by special rooms, no more special rooms can generate. The boss room is always the first room to be placed in the furthest away position, because without that room, the player would have no way of progressing. The effect of procedural generation of the game's layout is what you're seeing now. I cannot memorise this space and use my knowledge of it to quickly navigate to the boss. Instead, I need to feel my way out through these rooms and hope that I'm going in the right direction. I'm usually not. I'm caught in a continual process of uncovering the game's space before it is taken away from me, and I need to start again. So the Binding of Isaac is just a load of players bumbling around in the dark, just hoping to know what's coming? Well, not exactly. Instead, after many hours of play, players can begin intuiting the rules I was talking about earlier, which guide the generation of space. They begin to learn the spatial grammar of the Binding of Isaac and act it out through play. To understand this phenomena, I turn to Michel de Certeau, French philosopher and notorious gamer. Not really, but maybe. And in particular, his work on pedestrian speech acts as a way of understanding the relationship players have with the space they're uncovering. De Certeau states that the act of walking is to the urban system what the speech act is, to the language or to the statements uttered. In other words, the act of walking is a system put into action, with rules and functions which dictate its length, direction and orientation. To walk around a city is to commit a pedestrian speech act. It is to see the forms and features of the city's surface and to interact with them. De Soto's pedestrian speech acts are made up of 3 elements. Now for this talk I am only going to discuss the first 2 elements. My chapter does go into and covers the 3rd element, but I just really cannot fit this into the talk today, unfortunately. The first one is appropriation. The walker uses a topographical system just as the speaker appropriates and takes on language. The second is the spatial acting out. The walker charts their own course within the system just as the speech act is an acoustic acting out of language. And finally, the one I'm not covering is relations, which is the walker by walking connecting themselves to environments and other people. It is important to note that the city space De Soto is talking about is not static. At a moment-to-moment scale, traffic, roadworks and other people can change the topographical system daily, as well as larger changes over a more extended period of time. However, the city space is not reinvented each morning. Walkers do not have to remap routes as they find their destination is now to the south rather than the north. As such, one-to-one mapping of pedestrian speech acts from the city to the game is not really possible, but there are aspects which are useful for establishing how games' use of PCG affects the player's experience of a game space. To begin, the first element is identified as a process of appropriation of the topographical system. The walker absorbs and appropriates the system of space around them by, for example, using paths made for the pedestrian movement. In the same way, speaking requires the system of language to be known to the speaker to then be used. In both cases, it is the grammar of that system which the user is appropriating. Grammar is both an understanding of the relations between the individual aspects within the whole, so verbs, adverbs, nouns, punctuations, etc., etc., and the rules for using these aspects to be successful in being understood. This is in language in the spatial system of a city, and I argue within digital games. This is visible during play in 2 forms. The first is found in what can be seen. The player observes and recognises the shape of an individual room and its features. So, for example, in the rooms that we're in here currently, there's a door to the north and the door to the south. I can go through either of those to advance. If I went to the south, that would be actually advancing me back the other way is the way I came. Can't see any spike traps or anything like that on the floor, but if you saw like tiny little spiky bits, if I stood on those I would get hurt, and I probably have done many times in this playthrough. But the visuals cue you into what's going on. The appropriation of systems also happens at a secondary level of unseen code. There are a couple of walls per level which can be bombed to expose a secret or super secret room. There's no sign that points to the correct walls and says, please bomb here, but still players with a lot of experience in the game can often find them without much trouble. The lines of code which control the placement of secret and super secret rooms is never exposed to the player, but can be learnt without direct teaching. The player is learning the spatial grammar of how the layout of the stage is likely to look without knowing the specifics. Through extended play, the rules found within the code, which govern the placement of rooms, can be understood by the player without direct reading. The experience of gaining an understanding of the game's rules and functions is explained by YouTuber SimVictor, who uploads a playthrough of a seed every day. He stated during one of those videos that you will get to the point where you can find secret rooms without actually seeing the rest of the map. However, as he continues, that is not always the case, and the player's current appropriation of the spatial grammar can fail and need to be updated. Learning a spatial grammar is not the same as having an exact knowledge of the layout of the current floor. This is because grammar identifies possible locations for secret rooms, but if there are multiple possible locations available, only one will be correct. Regardless of if the player chooses the correct wall or not, they know to look there because they have started to appropriate the spatial system which the algorithm used to build the floor they are on. The second aspect is that De Soto identifies is as part of pedestrian speech acts is that it is a spatial acting out of the place. The movement of the individual acts out the system, just as the speech act is an acoustic acting out of language. In The Binding of Isaac, this manifests as a player using the controller to navigate Isaac through the stage, uncovering the new iteration of space the algorithm has presented. Even before an appropriation of the spatial systems can take place, the player must act them out so that trial and error of learning a game's spatial grammar can begin. The systems must be used for it to be acted out. As such, the player must, for example, walk through doors to make it to the next room and bomb the correct wall to access the secret room. It is by playing and acting out the game's space that the rules become apparent on screen. Ooh, dear me, I died. Anybody who had bets for them? Pedestrians, according to Deserto, actualise an instance of the system, presenting a version of movement through the city which can be formed. In the same way, players actualise the spatial system of The Binding of Isaac that would cease to exist at a visual level without the player's interaction and acting out of the system. This is also subject to failure. A player can lose a run, as seen there, and never see the end. You know, if you do play that seed, let me know how things go for you. The level is never acted out and left uncovered. Left covered. Regardless of if the player fails or succeeds, the individual actualization of the system is temporary as the player enters a cycle of uncovering the map steadily before it is lost again. The full layout is hidden when a playthrough of The Binding of Isaac begins, unless a seed is inputted which a player has watched in someone else play, like if you did mine. And even then, certain aspects will change dependent on their skill level. In this sense, the knowledge which would have been available to the player immediately in a different game, either through the game itself or through online guides, unfolds as their time within a specific iteration of the game increases. As such, the player becomes a cartographer of the space around them, mapping the level only to leave the map at the exit and begin a new one with the next level. Following Deserto then, the player's exploration causes the game's spatial system to emerge, which adds to the player's overall knowledge about that particular stage. The knowledge is cyclical and transitory. It is always increasing as mapping takes place, but once that has finished, the knowledge is made redundant. It becomes useless, and as a new, completely unmapped area must be traversed, and the cycle of gathering spatial knowledge begins anew. So, the procedural content generation in The Binding of Isaac requires players to treat the space as a language, which has a set of rules or grammar underlying it. Players act the space out, using the rules to uncover their own path through the specific iterations set out by the algorithm. But this is a transitory process which is subject to a lot of error. So what? As I ask myself. Well, as I stated earlier, The Binding of Isaac is created within a biblical Gothic mode. It uses biblical references alongside images of horror to create the atmosphere players experience. It is also Gothic because it asks players to engage in a process of uncovering which mirrors the uncovering that Gothic protagonists engage in. The traditional journey of gaining knowledge in a Gothic text often culminates in the uncovering of a secret passageway or room. A spatial uncovering is paired with an uncovering of a secret. For example, in the film Crimson Peak, although I won't give specific spoilers, Edith's discovery of both the cellar and the attic are aligned with the revelations about what the Sharp siblings are up to. This is a linear process. The reader and the audience and the protagonist are often aligned by how much is hidden to them within the text and the fiction's world, with the journey to the end of the novel being one that builds towards the climactic moment of the reveal. The Binding of Isaac turns that linear process into a cycle. The player completes a run having uncovered all the space needed to make it to the end of the game, or they die with the reveal denied to them, only to be brought back to the initial floor to engage once again in the act. See, I just died so that you could see that this happens, that it's a cycle. That's the reason I died. The procedural generation of these spaces allows for players to do this indefinitely. There is always a new floor to explore and chart, more hidden secret rooms to uncover. This could appear to be a process of mastery, a clear movement from ignorance to knowledge, but this is never guaranteed in a single run due to the game's difficulty. Any particular run could end prematurely. A total uncovering of the floor's layout can only be achieved through manual exploration of the space, an acting out of the spatial grammar of the game, a process which leaves rooms still hidden due to a lack of skill or a lack of pickups such as bombs, keys or hearts. Players continually engage in the process of uncovering as part of play, and although this is a violent uncovering, one which becomes a byproduct of the game's use of violent verbs such as shoot and bomb, it is an effective theme which is shared by Gothic texts. Procedural content generation becomes a tool for expressing a narrative in the Gothic mode, as it places the player in a perpetual state of exploration and uncovering. Both the player and the protagonist of a Gothic text are tasked with revealing secrets and horrors that are contained within a space which must be uncovered. But for players, that process extends as long as they are playing the game, as the potential horrors and disorientations never cease. As such, procedural generation of space creates a version of the Gothic which actually teeters towards parody, an exaggeration of the actions of a Gothic text achieved through their extension. Although I would not argue that this makes it somehow more Gothic than its predecessors, it does create a held note of Gothic which players can return to engage with indefinitely. A sustained, effective feeling which cannot, I will end on, be easily achieved in any other media. And that's it. Woo! Thank you so much for coming to listen to the event today and sitting through my frankly terrible gameplay. Future me is there with you now and looking forward to any comments and questions that you have. In the meantime, I'm going to watch the end of the run and never tell you how it ends. Ha ha ha. Goodbye.
Thank you, Charlotte. That was fantastic, and I think it worked very well to have the non-live live stream, I suppose. It's generated many more questions and comments in the chat, and I believe Chloe has sent me a list of questions, which I shall endeavour to get through now. So we have them separated into questions for Sean, questions for Charlotte, and for both. So we'll go through them in turn. Paul Wake asks, Sean, is there a distinction to be made between game psychopathy and clinical, filmic, and literary psychopathy?
Sorry, the camera was off. I would group literary, filmic, and game psychopathy as fictional psychopathy, and there's a distinction between clinical psychopathy and fictional psychopathy, the former being APD, which includes the DSM-5 symptoms like pervasive patterns of disregard for the rights of others, deceitfulness, irresponsibility, lack of empathy, aggressiveness, and most importantly, no regard for concepts of right and wrong. And the latter, fictional psychopathy, being characterized by violence and criminality like we see in popular culture. Regarding games in particular, because of the medium's increased level of interactivity, exploring the psychopathic tendencies in audiences are further enabled than they are, say, in a film or a novel. In this way, interestingly, because the audience outside of the text is further focused on, game psychopathy aligns more closely, well, the closest to clinical psychopathy than filmic or literary psychopathy. Hopefully that answers the question.
Hopefully it does, Paul. There's another question. Paul again, I think. In replays, where players tend to explore different choices, is the fun found in a different aspect of the game to the original play in which they connect more closely with the choices that they make?
Is this me as well, or?
Yeah. Okay. I'll go two for you and then two for Charlotte, I think.
Okay. I'd say the fun is found in a different aspect of the game, whereby it's more a case of intentionally uncovering content that we haven't seen yet. Also, having played a good playthrough, we're more familiar with and invested in the story than we were the first time around. So it's arguably more exciting getting new content than in the second playthrough, despite being more emotionally invested the first time around. So first playthroughs are, for me, are about an emotional investment, whereas the second is more about narrative curiosity.
Hopefully that answers Paul's questions. Now one for Charlotte from Greg, who asks, could you touch on what is meant by morality in your talk? What is the game's construction of morality and how does it inform or challenge the players?
That's a very interesting question, and I'll be honest, morality isn't really anything that I particularly touch on, but the actions that the player is doing is to just survive. I think there is an element of actions being purely for survival rather than like any kind of particular moral oh, I want to do good or I want to do evil. I just want to get through to the end and I just don't want to be smushed by anything along the way. I do think though you could probably, there's definitely a talk in there in terms of looking at its biblical counterparts and the kind of morality that a lot of the interpretations of the biblical story suggest that it's God saying that we shouldn't do human sacrifices. That's a moral, like, no. And there are all sorts of other different interpretations. So how that then links to the game's version of it, unfortunately, I haven't got my list of references. There are definitely people talking about that. I just don't have it to hand at the moment. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Just following on from something Chloe put in the chat box, the game seems so fast-paced to actually think about any of these considerations. You know, is that a factor or?
Yeah, it is quite frenetic. I was actually, when I was doing the playthrough, I was trying to work out how fast I should do it, if I should slow down how I'm playing, because I found myself, because I play this game a lot, and so for example, when you get to the bosses, there's usually like a thing that says Isaac versus the boss, and it's like a really big cutscene, and I was just clicking through it during my playthrough and not thinking about it, and I thought, oh no, maybe people actually want to see this, but I was trying to speed it up. So yes, I do think it probably does have something to do with that.
Okay, I think this is from Chloe. A related question is, this is for Sean, sorry, a related question, is metafiction a potentially ethical mode of representation because it invites commentary? And is this more apparent in games because of their interactivity? I think she said you've answered this to some extent in your paper, she'd like to hear more.
Okay. I'd say it's both. Metafiction is potentially a more ethical mode of representation because it at least invites the audience to contemplate on our engagement with violent content. But I do say potentially here because while games like Undertale enable players to skip violent content altogether, majority of games involve the player inflicting some kind of virtual violence in order to function, like Spec Ops: The Line. Such games simultaneously require us to perform virtual violence and critique these very actions that they require us to do. Second part of the question is also, yes, this is more apparent in games because of their interactivity, precisely because it's the interactivity that enables the medium to do this, to make us contemplate on our engagement with violence.
Okay, and Chloe follows up with the reference to fallen humans in Undertale suggests a commentary on the idea of the fall as myth. Is there a mythical theological aspect here, and how does this relate to the idea of the postmodern psychopath?
The two that I'm thinking of, like Loki is mentioned in the question, and I'm not an expert on like I'm more of like a contemporary person. The earliest example I can think of is Hedda Gabler, you know, that play where the lead character just wants to test out all of these evil actions simply to just see what happens because she feels like she doesn't have any agency in her own life. That's the earliest example I can think of right now.
Okay. And Charlotte, Jack asked that he's curious to get your perspective on Hades, which punctuates the randomness and forward motion with return trips to, I'm going to mispronounce this, Zagreus's literal home. That question
yes.
means something to you?
Yeah, yes, Zagreus, you got it right. I love that game. I'm obsessed with it. I've just picked it up on PS5 to start playing through it again from the beginning. It is something that I'm really interested in, and I think it's something that the industry seems to be pushing towards, is ways of bringing roguelikes to a more mainstream AAA kind of audience, although Hades is an indie. For example, Returnal as well is another example of a game which has a structure which brings you after each playthrough to a particular hub, although the Hades hub is a lot more intensive in storytelling. It's something that I'm thinking through at the moment, so I've got no concrete thoughts to present here, but it's something I am very much got on my mind at the moment, in thinking about how storytelling can both be cyclical and linear at the same time. It's almost like it loops back onto itself on a straight line constantly. But yeah, no, thank you for that question.
Well, I hope that answers it, Jack. The frustration of knowledge as mastery seems to be an increasing thematic concern in contemporary games. Do you think this is true? I think that's from Jack as well.
Sorry, what was that one again? Sorry.
Sorry, the frustration of knowledge as mastery seems to be an increasing thematic concern in contemporary games. Do you think this is true? Not 100% sure if that's a question, well, it's a question, but whether you can answer that.
Yeah, it's a frustration of
frustration of knowledge as mastery seems to be an increasing thematic concern in contemporary games.
Yeah, it's in the chapter that this comes from, I talk a lot about maps and that kind of positioning, top-down positioning, which the Binding of Isaac almost has. It's kind of isometric, kind of top-down, and that kind of, if you have that spatial knowledge, then you become like a master of the space. So GTA 5, you can see where the police are. Well, on the street, in normal life, you don't just have a map where the police suddenly appear on your map and you can go, oh yeah, they're down that street, I'm going to go down this one. It seems to be like the more knowledge you can accrue in a lot of contemporary games, the stronger you become. And I think there is a level of frustration that has come out in smaller indie games or certain titles which try to complicate that relationship and stop it being quite so one to the next one. I hope that answers.
I hope so too. There's a question for both of you, which I was going to ask, but Paul's beating me to it, so I'll credit to Paul Wake, who's asked, what is the impact of the 8-bit-like or emulated graphics and sound on the player's connection to the game world's moral choices and how these choices explored? Because that struck me, because obviously they're not realistic games as such. So does that have an impact on those aspects or not?
Which one of us will go?
Either one of you. Sean, go first if you want.
Okay, so I do think Undertale is significant regarding debates around realistic representation in games, specifically the argument that more lifelike human-looking characters generate a stronger emotional effect in players. It's been contested by critics a lot as unnecessary, while photorealistic graphics have been found to hinder players' emotional resonance. So games like Until Dawn, if people have played that, employs motion capture, and that's been described by players in terms of the uncanny valley, whereby the characters almost resemble real people, but not entirely, and that kind of induces feelings of revulsion rather than increased affinity. So instead, it's been observed that players tend to remember what happens in games rather than their appearance. We tend to describe story moments in the game, not the realistic graphics. They're not as important. Emotional resonance is also driven by strong world building, compelling, believable writing, and engaging in scenarios that make the player's actions feel more integral to the experience. So Undertale's exploitation of the medium's capacity to tell more soul-burning stories and the creation of well-developed characters have been found to make it particularly difficult for players to harm them. This is important in terms of advancing realism in games. So because games are an active medium that require constant physical input by the player, a realistic game must be realist in doing rather than in action. So rather than in looking, as it is with something like cinema. There's a critic called Alexander Galloway, and he says that games are realist in terms of a congruence between the social reality depicted in the game and the social reality known and lived by the gamer. So while Undertale features heavily stylized monster characters, among the reasons the game has been found by players to be emotionally resonant is that it incorporates universally relatable themes like loneliness, anxiety, friendship, and community. So that Undertale reprimands players for their engagement with the game medium itself means it more closely resembles the social context in which the players live, making the game, by Galloway's characterization at least, more realistic.
Charlotte?
Well, the visuals of The Binding of Isaac, I think, originally came out of the fact that it's part of a game jam and part of a very small production team that so the 8-bit was most likely just more cost efficient. However, I do think it's got a level of cuteness to it that comes out of an 8-bit look, which I think lets it get away with a lot more than during that playthrough, I was quite concerned when I was coming into rooms with like hanging people who were shooting, and I thought, oh, I hope that people don't mind this too much when they look at this. But they're chibiified, and kind of the 8-bit kind of nature of it, I think, softens that kind of the brutality of the situation and what Isaac is actually going through, if you were going in it in a narrative kind of sense.
Okay, well, hopefully, Paul, that answers your question. And this one's from Rob, again, for both of you, who's wondering how we might think about the completionist impulse Undertale riffs on in relation to procedurally generated games, where no single player could ever see every permutation.
It is sorry, I'll go ahead if that's okay, Sean. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, completing a roguelike is like pretty much impossible, and there's almost a sadistic or kind of level to it where, I mean, I've put hundreds of hours into these games and I will never see the end. I've not even got all the Steam achievements, and it's going to go continually onwards. It just unravels in front, but I think it's a draw. If you've got something, for me, it's something that I can just put on and play and not really necessarily think too deeply about it, and maybe have something on in the background. And I know it's never going to end, that it's going to be constantly asked for me to come back to it. And I like coming back to it, and I like playing it. It's a comfort thing. So yeah, the draw for completionists, has anybody completed The Binding of Isaac? No, surely not. Oh my word, someone's just told me, someone's just said it's 486 hours. Oh my God. I've not put quite that many hours in, but I've put quite close too.
Wow. Sean, do you have a comment on that question?
I think the idea of where game developers add additional content to it, sometimes games are potentially endless, like online games. So it might be impossible to complete certain games. I'm thinking of like online multiplayer games like Genshin Impact. I don't know anybody that's completed that 100%. So I don't know if that's going to frustrate the player or if that's encouraging, like Charlotte suggested. So I think it's kind of, I think it would depend on the person.
Well, whether they've got 486 hours to
Yeah.
to spare. Not many of us. Yeah, well, Sean, you've already answered the one relating to Loki and Iago et al. If there are other questions that probably come through the chat, which I haven't been keeping an eye on, obviously, so I don't know if Chloe has, if there's any more direct questions that have come through, Chloe.
Hello, I will just speak as a voice from beyond. I do have a question from Jack. There's a few more that have come in as well. There's a question from Jack here, and I think it's directed at Charlotte, but it's about the concept of players uncovering and how that might map onto Espinas's concepts of aporia and epiphany. And he also mentions Cameron Kunzelman's arguments for game play as an empirical process. And I don't know if Charlotte's kind of aware of those theories about play or not, but
no.
but possibly worth writing them down, Charlotte.
Yes, I'm a terrible game scholar, and I will put my hand up to things. I have not read those, and that's okay, but I will definitely look them up. So thank you so much. It's an
interesting question, and thanks to Jack, and I just wonder if it allows you to reflect a little bit on the idea of play as uncovering, and what you mean by that. As an idea of what play is.
I think any game is a process of uncovering. It's just when that process ends, which plays with what necessarily the game is trying to do. So things which can spiral out endlessly, like the procedural content generation stuff, that kind of uncovering can lead to more, I think, interesting genre stuff that you can do with it. Not to say that games which are linear and you stop with uncovering are not genre or aren't interesting. I just think there's something about these particular games and the process being perpetual, which has narrative interest, which I don't think has necessarily been completely tapped, though Hades is giving it a good go.
Thank you for that, Charlotte. I'll just read one more comment that came up in the chat, and then I'll hand back over to Matt to finish off the session today. And that is from Idil, who says that they just wanted to share their thesis about creative and digital labour of meme making and dissemination. And they're talking here about Sean's talk and Undertale as a well-memed game within digital culture, and thinking about how this is because perhaps of the shared undercurrent of postmodern nihilism within digital culture that kind of Undertale is tapping into. And I suppose there's not a question there, as Idil says, but thank you for sharing that, Idil. But just wondered perhaps, Sean, if you want to finish off the discussion session by maybe just talking about whether you think Undertale is drawing on a kind of shared undercurrent of postmodern nihilism that is pervasive across digital culture or common in other areas of digital culture, not just in games. Is that something you've thought about?
I think it might, in terms of the many mysteries that Toby Fox likes to continuously incorporate in Undertale, like the later game that he made, like Deltarune, which might not be connected to Undertale. It generates that kind of a cult spectatorship among gamers. It gets people to go online, like Reddit, and talk about what they think might mean in this part of the game. It gets them to theorize. I think that it draws on that kind of communal aspect of the game, whereby we'll play a game and then we might tweet about it or go online and talk about it with other people, or even through watch-alongs where we're watching somebody else play it and commenting on it, and they might answer you back. If that answers the question, I think it's that kind of like online discourse that has become a part of gaming culture, whereby we're playing it and we're also talking about it with other players like across the world. Does that answer the question? Or?
Yes, great, thank you. And Idil has just said thanks in the chat as well, so thanks for responding to that comment. Okay, I'm gonna hand back over to Matt now, who can finish us off, and I'll hide again.
Thanks, Chloe. And just to say thank you to both Charlotte and Sean. They were actually really fascinating papers, and they've stimulated a lot more conversation and questions than we've probably fielded or can field in the time. But thank you to everyone for your contributions and your input and everything. And thanks for great attendance. And I will just bid everybody farewell, and we will see you again soon, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. It's been
really
fun. Really cool.